We'll kick this video off with some time-lapse action of walls being framed up and lifted into place. But then kind of the main core of this video is going to be talking about Zip R. We're using Zip R in this project on most of the wall sheathing, and we had to solve for a couple issues that I haven't seen solved for in this way before. And I think that the solutions that we came up with around door and window treatments is unique. At least I've not seen anybody do it like this, and I think that it's pretty good ideas. It's better than what I've seen out there in the past. So if Zip R is something that you might be using in one of your projects, definitely check this thing out.
Ahorita la vas a levantar, señor.
So you saw them raising some walls there and putting some sheathing on, and they were building the walls kind of on the on the floor and then standing them up with the sheathing on it. And so this is what we're looking like. We got all this green Zip out here, and so Zip is made by the same company, Huber, who makes that Advantech X Factor like we talked about for the subfloor in a prior video, except this one is for outside vertical wall sheathing, and then they also have a thicker version that would be for roof decking, which we'll talk about in another video. Now we don't yet have all of the zip tape on the seams. I want to leave that open so that I can make sure that the nailing pattern looks good before it gets all covered up. And now I want to point out something here. So the garage here is not going to have the same exact zip that we're using up in the living space, with the difference being we're just going to use a standard zip, 7/16 zip for the garage area, and we're using a more exotic thing that's called a Zip R that has a layer of foam actually bonded to the back of it. Let me grab a piece to show. So here is a normal piece of zip, right? 7/16 thick, got the green coat on one side, that's your weather resistant barrier, and you know, their OSB layer on the back. If you look at a piece of Zip R, it's the same exact face, but on the back you have a layer of polyiso foam here. And this particular one is called the Zip R6, and it has a 1-inch layer of this foam. They make it in R3, which has a total panel thickness of 1 inch. So you basically get a 1/2 inch of OSB and a 1/2 inch of foam. The R6, which will go up, you know, the same 1/2 inch panel with a full inch of foam. R9, you get 1.5 inches of foam, and R12, you get 2 inches of foam for a total 2.5 inch. The Zip R installs pretty much exactly the same way as the regular Zip, and you know, you use the tape and all that. There are a couple things to be aware of, little nuances that you should be aware of. I'll talk about those in a minute, but in terms of why, you know, what's the point of using this? So there's a problem. There's a problem in kind of your standard framing, right? And insulation, really. It comes down to an insulation thing. So over here, for instance, where we have Zip R that we're using, you know, you have all your studs, right? And you put your sheathing up against your studs. You know, let's assume it's just, you know, regular sheathing. Forget this insulation. You put the sheathing up against the studs, and then you insulate from the inside. You put, you know, bats or whatever, some sort of insulation between the studs, in the stud cavities, in the stud bays, and so that gives you, you know, insulation on your walls. Now the problem is that you'd have insulation from here to here, but not here. And I mean, if you step back and you look at, you know, even if you have like 16-inch on center framing, there's a whole lot of wood, you know, in windows and doors, and times where you have, you know, structural columns and all that kind of stuff, where you end up having no insulation. You just have chunks of wood in there. And so I think wood has like an R value of 1, you know, R1 per inch or something like that. And so you end up having, every time that you have a stud, heat or cold, you know, whatever, you have thermal transfer through the stud. And so if you take a look at a thermal camera from inside of a finished house pointed at the wall, you would actually be able to see all of the studs, the location of all of the studs, just purely off of thermal. So it just basically is less efficient. So what you can do to prevent that, they call that thermal bridging. What you can do to prevent the thermal bridging is you have insulation on the outside. And so now we have our sheathing, you know, here with a layer of insulation that goes across the entire surface. So even when we're at studs, we have insulation, at least some amount of insulation. You know, it's only an R6, but that goes a long way towards making things more efficient. So we'll have the R6 on the outside everywhere, stop that thermal bridging, and then put insulation as normal within the stud cavities. Now, having a thicker sheathing, right? I mean, we end up with a thicker sheathing now, so it's an extra inch. So a couple things you have to be aware of. One is you're going to need to use longer nails. So typically, I think it's like a 2.5 inch nail, or maybe even a 2-inch nail is enough to go through a 1/2 inch of sheathing and get the required 1.5 inch bite into the stud. Now we've got an extra inch in there, and so we're actually using 3-inch nails, so we get, you know, 1.5 inches, and then we still have the 1.5 inches to bite into the stud. The other thing that it does is, let me show an example. Hold on. All right, so typically, right, here's a door opening, okay, exterior door. So typically what it would be is you take, you know, a piece of sheathing, you'd have something like this, where the sheathing just meets the edge of the rough opening, and you have a nice flat joint here, so that when you put your window in, you know, you've got wood on the inside, wood here on the outside. So whether you're using a flange and nailing it in here, or you have a different style where you have brackets, you know, angle brackets, 90-degree angle brackets, and you're installing onto this face, you're covered either way. Right, now, if we take a look at the same, you know, the same kind of setup, door opening, you put your sheathing up, you look at the side, this is a bit of a problem because you've got foam here. So if you think about that in terms of a windowsill, for instance, that would have a geometry that kind of looks like this, where you'd have your OSB or your weatherproof barrier out here and a layer of foam, and then you get to your windowsill. Well, you really don't want that. You know, this is not a great joint. It's hard to kind of, you know, treat that and make that waterproof. And also, if you have, you know, bracket mounts, you might be, you know, screwing into foam, and obviously that gives like zero holding power. And so you have to come up with another idea. So when I searched around for how you know, solve this problem, what I found was that like some really well-known builders, they were advocating for a methodology that was basically like this. You have your zip R on your front face, and then you just rip a piece of, you know, regular zip and put it on that inside face. And, you know, that seems fine, I guess, but, you know, again, if you're trying to nail into you know, this area, you still have now only a 1/2 inch of OSB, which doesn't have a tremendous amount of holding power, and the foam is right behind it. So if you're in that first, you know, 1.5 inches from the edge, from the outside of the window, it's just not really, you don't really have a robust backing. And so, you know, I thought of another idea, which I'll show you here. So here's the trick. We've got, you know, a window opening here, right? We can see it's the zip R sheathing, right? So there's our inch of foam, you know, our 2x6 stud, OSB face. If we actually look at the rough opening, what we can see is that, you know, we just have this zip running right up to the wood. So, you know, it's the same, you know, piece of insulation. So how did we do that? Well, this is actually a custom ripped board. So where we're using, you know, 2x6 framing, what we did is we took a piece of 2x8 and just ripped it down to exactly 6.5 inches. And so it finishes the same way that it would if you were using, you know, standard zip without the insulation, except there is, you know, insulation back behind that, right? So what you end up with is full real wood, a robust nailing surface, whether you're using, you know, the flange type of windows that would have, you know, nails or screws going in all around the border, or you're using the angle bracket type that would have it going into the side. Either way, you're covered and you really can't tell. And so what it looks like, you know, before the sheathing goes on, is like this, where you have, you know, an extra inch of wood around your framing, or your rough openings for your doors and windows have this little extra piece sticking out. And so it gives a very nice, clean, finished look. And if you have instances, I think I have one over here. Yeah, okay. So here we have a PSL. You know, there's a big structural load above, and so we're transferring that down. You can't exactly get, you know, a custom made PSL and then, you know, rip it down, you know, all that. That would be ridiculous. And so all you need to do is just take a rip, just basically like a little strip of, you know, of lumber, either 2x, or you can probably just use, you know, stack like 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood or OSB, but we just used 1 inch of actual lumber to form that. And you don't need to carry it all the way down. So you can see, you know, we come down here and we have the insulation, you know, showing down here. We aren't going to need to cover that because we'll just have another piece of zip that goes in on the bottom of that. So that was one little trick that we came up with. So here's a good example of what you want to do on outside corners and inside corners where they meet. So there's an outside corner, and you can see we basically cut. Let me scoot over a little bit. You see the foam comes all the way up to the edge here, right? And so this one, it's one panel, but we ripped out an inch or an inch and a half of the foam from this one so that the OSB layer can go all the way up to the corner and have that kind of continuity. Now you could do it where you rip an inch and a half like they've done here, or you could just rip an inch and have this panel be the one that comes up to the edge. Either way, the point is you want to try to get that foam to be continuous around and not leave any gap at the edge. For an inside corner, it's kind of similar. You just have one panel that kind of runs all the way up to the edge so you can get your nailing down on the edge, and then you just butt this panel right up to that. The OSB will touch the OSB. That gap is just kind of negligible right there. And so that's what you want to do. Now I'll show one more example of a different type. Hold on. All right, so over here we actually have 135 degree or 45 degree, however you want to call it, wall. Another one here. So when you run into that situation, you can't really do the same thing. You have to do something more. I'll get a view of it more like that. Where either one or both of the panels ends up with a miter in it, so that you can achieve the same thing. This one, they left the one on the right just flat, and they put the full 45 degree miter on the one on the left. You could do it where you have both of them 22.5 degrees mitered, just to make that a little bit cleaner, but really either way is kind of fine as far as I can tell. So overall, looking pretty good. A few little things, of course, we gotta fix up, little details, but we'll just keep rolling for now, and we'll get back to it. Hopefully, if you decide to work with that Zip R, this little door window tricks and kind of getting the corners right, hopefully that's helpful.